Hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen. I am so excited for you educating yourself by listening to this podcast. In the podcast realm, the real estate industry is a big industry, and there's lots of podcasts about real estate. However, there's a few podcasts that are super active, like my guest today is on his podcast. In several of my programs, I keep hearing about this guy, Axel. Axel, you have to have Axel on your podcast. So I reached out to Axel, and he's with us today. Welcome, Axel Meierhoefer. Hi.
Hey, Jennifer. Good. How are you?
I am doing really well. We got back to Maui last night. So we left Canada and we're back on Maui, and you are on the other side of the world, literally. Tell us where you are.
Right now, I'm at the Spanish coast. It's called the Costa Blanca in Spain.
You're in Spain. So it's 8:30 in the morning Maui time. It's 8:30 at night Spain time, which I think is pretty cool. All good. All good. So how on earth are you doing US real estate in Spain?
Well, one thing, the whole approach that I've developed well before we ever came here to Spain was how do you invest out of state? And lately I've realized it could even be out of country. So, if you have the right model, you can be anywhere and keep doing it.
Wonderful. Well, tell us how you approach real estate. I mean, just there's so many questions. People are just jumping into real estate going, "Hey, I'm not in the same city. How do I set myself up?" And here we are talking about doing real estate in different countries, different time zones, which you and I do practically every day. How do you evaluate real estate in your model?
Well, the first thing when I first started that I wanted to really look into is real estate, and you have used the term, but I think much more for most people hearing about it, they think it's like a coherent thing, like everything that is somehow a building or a factory building or an office building or their house that they live in or the apartment that they used to be in when they were in college or whatever, dorms, everything is real estate. And in a way, I would actually rather like the term infrastructure, right? And then you go and say, okay, well, so which part of the stuff that would be considered building as part of infrastructure are we in? And I differentiate three parts. The purely commercial, like a factory building or stuff like that. Then what's called commercial residential, like a 150 unit apartment complex or something like that. And then there is the purely residential, which is anything from a single family home to a fourplex, triplex, duplex. And the rules are different for each one of those categories. And for me, when I first started, having had this military career, having moved around a lot, basically all I knew was just the pure residential. So I was thinking, okay, well, I know that it makes sense. How can I get into it? And what didn't work so well is that I had just accepted a job in the Santa Barbara area in California. And when you look around there at the time, 20 years ago, same today, I mean, if you're not already rich, you can't really invest. I would suspect it's somewhat similar probably in Maui as well. So you start asking yourself, well, if I want to invest in something that I can afford as a normal person having a normal job, what do I do? And I just started looking where are properties that I could afford, and they were all anywhere between 500 and 2,000 miles away. And
Right.
then the question became, how do you actually handle that? And in your case, probably more like 4,000 miles away, right? Like, so, and one thing that really helped a lot, there's a guy out there by the name of Chris Closure, who I'm very grateful to that he at some point sat down and wrote down a little bit of the history of his family as well as what his family does. They were originally, when he wrote the book, by the way, the title is The Turnkey Revolution. He wrote that when he was a member of Memphis Invest. Nowadays, they call themselves REI Nation. And what he basically said is what his family does is helping investors to invest in properties that are not where they live, because they basically act as a turnkey provider that does everything for the investor. And I'm like, wow, cool. Are you the only ones, or are there other ones out there? And I discovered this is actually an industry. And that was my first foray into it, to discover that. And then I realized, okay, you need lenders and insurance and inspectors and appraisers and all these other things. And so I discovered all of that mainly and originally because I started a business and I realized if I don't want to work in this business forever, I have to have some plan for retirement. Well, and then I'm a babbler. That's why I have a podcast opportunity to babble all day long, right? And so and I used to tell people about what I'm doing and what's the next deal and what's the next property, and more encourage me. Hey, maybe, you know, can I do this too? Can you help me do this as well? And some people said you should make it official, kind of like, you know, you dated with this thing long enough, you should make it official. And so I created Ideal Wealth Grower, and you know, I thought quite a while about it. If I don't know if you want to take the time to discover, it's not just 3 words, it's actually a little bit more meaning behind it.
Well, tell us more.
Okay. So ideal is a good word that you want in investing, especially in real estate investing, and wealth we all want. And grower is also something, you know, you want to grow your portfolio. So why is it not just a 3-term name? It's ideal stands for we want to generate income from rent. We want to have depreciation for our tax returns. We want to have equity, partially out of our down payment, but also when our tenants pay down our mortgage. We want to have appreciation. So, you know, like when the Fed is printing money, we appreciate that. Even though inflation is maybe not ideal, but hey, we take it. And then we want to have leverage so that you and I can put 20% or maybe maximum 25% in one of our deals, and the bank or like a lender of some kind is giving us the rest. So we have leverage, basically 4-to-1 or 5-to-1, depending on which applies. So that's ideal, right? And those are all the things that actually contribute. And oftentimes people, when they think about real estate, and let's say they down selected from the big, all 3 encompassing infrastructure to that one area of just residential, the thing that they compare it to is like a stock, where if you buy a stock like Nvidia for $120 today, you have to give them $120 and you get 1 stock. Well, if you really wanted to compare it, I can basically buy something akin to Nvidia for $30, right? Because I only have to put like about 20% or 25% in, so that's about $30. I still own the same amount of the company Nvidia, or in our case, a building. And when they say, okay, how does it behave? They say, oh, look, I bought it for 120, now it's 130. Well, if you take ideal, I would say, oh, that's cool. You appreciate it by these $10, but you also got rent. Somebody paid down your mortgage. You got basically the $10 with only putting 30 in. So your percentage gain is way higher than when you put 120 in, right? And so forth. So that's ideal. And I can talk about that in more detail, but that's kind of why I thought it was important to have it in our name, that we really want to take full advantage of this particular part of the industry, because it's totally different as soon as you say, I want to get like a 20-unit apartment complex, different ballgame.
Well, let's
on
talk
Grover,
about why that's different though, Axel. Sorry.
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the biggest difference that I always point out, and you're more an expert in it than I am, is that for one, we all enjoy, whether we own it ourselves or we do it as an investment, we have the opportunity to get a 30-year mortgage. While you will not find anybody who is going to finance an apartment complex for you for 30 years. Typical is 5-7. If you're super, super lucky, you might get a 10-year loan. That's one thing. The other thing is, if we buy a house like we just said for our 120,000, and then house keeps appreciating over the years, then, you know, the market basically dictates, and to some extent, what do the other houses around the one that we own do? What do they do? How do they behave? For what price do they sell? In this apartment complex, the only way to evaluate what it's worth is the rent roll. So if you buy one that has 100 units and every unit makes $1,000 rent, for easy calculation, so you make $100,000 a month, 1.2 million a year, and then you have a multiplier and you can maybe buy it for 6 million. So if the next day, for some crazy reason, you say, hey, I don't want this thing anymore. I love my Maui. I go away. You can't ask for anything more, whether there was inflation or whether there was another apartment complex next door that sold for twice as much, it doesn't matter. So how do people make appreciation in apartment complexes is they say, I want to find one, if it's not brand new, that has been a little bit neglected, that has maybe old 10, 15-year-old kitchens in it and old floors. So every time a tenant moves out, I renovate it, and then I can ask, let's say 1,500 rent instead of the 1,000. Well, so if you then say, okay, I used to make 1.2 million, now after a while, they call that stabilization. You have your 100 units and they make 150,000 a month. And what is that, like 1.6 million a year times the multiplier? So now your 100 unit complex is worth 7.2 million.
Right.
That's how you actually can get appreciation. And only that way. That's pretty much the only one that I know, at least, unless you find a crazy buyer who just gives you money, but that's pretty rare, right? So that's a big difference. There are other differences too, but that's the biggest difference. Besides the fact that you have to also keep in mind that in residential real estate, purely residential, and I always say this to your audience, to my audience, to people that I come across, we have a certain level of familiarity. We probably grew up either in an apartment or in a house. Then we got into a dorm or our first apartment. Then maybe, depending on when and what you do in your life and your career, you may get into your first small house. So this traditional pure residential real estate is somewhat familiar to us, right? We know how things were, if we liked living in it, if the rooms were too small, too big, the floor plan was awkward, whatever. Running an apartment building is something completely different. And to learn how to do it well, it's basically like a profession. And what ends up happening is, if you want to get into that part of the infrastructure real estate industry, and you go to a bank and say, I found this somewhat neglected 100-unit apartment complex, I have 100 or 200 or maybe $300,000 I can contribute. I need the remaining 6 million. They're going to look at you and say, Frankie, how many of those have you done and who have you done them with that we know and trust?
Right.
And if you have to say, sorry, this is my first one, they will probably, if they're nice, they won't just kick you out of the door. They will say, get yourself a partner who has a lot of experience and teaches you how to do it. And then after you've done 4 or 5 of those, then you come back. Well, in our area, in residential real estate, any lender, everything being equal, is only really looking, at least initially, there are obviously variations on everything. There's never just a simple single thing. But if you look at it really big picture, a lender, a bank is looking at you as the investor very similar, like they would be looking at you if you were to buy it for yourself to move in. The biggest issue, the biggest thing they're looking for is, how likely is it that you're going to pay the mortgage?
Right.
And that is determined by your credit score and by your history. Now, if I go there or you go there, Jennifer, and we say, look at my portfolio and look at my history, then it changes a little bit over time. But when you're relatively early, you state, okay, I give you a quick example. Let's say you happen to live in San Diego and you finally got this really cool job. You're making really good income and you ask yourself, should I buy or should I rent? Then you call Axel, you enroll in the mentoring program. He says, you rent. I explain later why. Then I show you where to buy. And then you buy, and the bank that you get the loan from is going to say, hey, Frankie, show me your credit score, show me your bank statements, show me your W-2, maybe your last tax return. And they would do the exact same thing if you were to buy that exact same house for moving in. So that is one of the big differences, and the level of familiarity that we have is definitely a benefit. Makes my life a little easier too in the mentoring, because what is a house and how is a house run and what does it mean to pay rent and stuff is not that unfamiliar. Now there's a whole bunch of other stuff that I'm teaching people in the mentoring program, but the subject matter itself, the house you buy as an investor or the house you buy for moving in, is not that much of a difference.
For sure. No, I like how you classify the 3 levels of infrastructure. I think that's that's very, very key. And one of the things that I found in dealing in those three realms, where you've got purely commercial, you've got multifamily 5 units and above, and then you've got residential 1 to 4 units. And we've dabbled in residential of all unit types, is also insurance. Insurance looks at that very differently. Also your local zoning will look at that differently as well. Like, for example, apartment buildings typically have to have their own business license because they're their own entity, right? Like, for example, whereas, you have a single family home, if you're in a municipality, doesn't necessarily need its own business license. But you're exactly right. Underwriting for multifamily, commercial residential, as you say, more than 5 units is different. And then, of course, in Canada, you're doing stress testing. They don't offer big, long amortization periods in Canada. Typically, they'll do a 30-year calculation, but then a 5-year term. And that's for pretty much anything, even a single family home. And so right now, what's brewing in Canada is you've got these people who have like 2-3% rates from before all this, adjusted. And now they're starting, the term is coming due. And so now all of the rates are going up to 5-6%. And they're having to refinance and recalculate, and it doesn't work. And so as a result, what's going to happen, and what's already happening, is everybody's dumping their houses for sale. And so inventory is going up, prices for sale of these single family homes is going down. We're already seeing it in Canada and British Columbia and across, it was on Global and CBC News for Canada, because we just spent many months in Canada. And so we're seeing that. But in the States, it's very interesting because, for those 1 to 4 units, you can get a 30-year mortgage, and then it's just even Steven. Now, we just refinanced one of our US properties at 6%, which is crazy to even say out loud. But, when interest rates go back down, hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll refinance and regroup and recalculate. And that's what you do. But it's very interesting how underwriters look at it, how lenders look at it, all of these appraisers look at these all differently, right? You're exactly right. Let me ask you another question though, Axel. I know you talked about your Ideal Investor Show. That's your podcast, but let's shift for 1 second, because you and I've talked a couple times, and you've got this concept of a pivot point in your business model. And I'd love for you to explain that.
Yeah. Well, the pivot point is something that came up because people in the progression of building their portfolio, right? Let's just, for simple calculation, say everybody or somebody who would join our program would just always buy the standard 3-bedroom, 2-bath, single family home.
Sure.
So then the next question is, okay, how much cash flow are you actually generating with this property? And there's obviously a difference between the gross cash flow and the net cash flow. And what I mean by that is, if you go in and say, okay, let's say for this house, the rent is $1,200, the mortgage, let's say, is $600, just for easy calculation, then you pay $120 for your property management, and so down to $480. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, what else do I have to consider? And the things that I recommend to consider is, you need to have some money when you have vacancy, when somebody has finished their lease and they move out and you need to have a new tenant, then you have to have something for maintenance, just stuff breaks. And then the third thing is, you want to accumulate money for the big stuff, like if the roof needs to be replaced, or I don't know, the kitchen or the bathroom or some big things, air conditioning systems, those kind of things. So CapEx, maintenance, vacancy. Now, if you think about it on a single property, you would say, okay, here's my 480. How much do I put aside every month for that? Let's say you just grab a number and say 280. So the remaining 200 is just literally my net cash flow. I can go and take Jennifer to dinner or something like that, right? And the rest goes basically in what we call the reserve account. And on a single property for a single month, we now know it's 280. Well, that happens every month, so it's basically $3,000 a year. But we're not building a portfolio of one house. So now let's just say you buy next year, you buy another one, another $3,000, right? So now you have 3 plus 3 is 6, and the third one, the fourth one. So typically around the 4th or 5th house, assuming you buy kind of on average one every year, and you add this up, even if you had a few maintenance costs and a few things, you probably end up accumulating somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000. And the question, what I call the pivot point, and it's a little bit of an individual thing. I jokingly always say you have to answer the question, how many roofs can fly away from your portfolio all at once? Because when you ask somebody, what's the most expensive thing to replace as a CapEx expense, it's typically the roof.
The roof.
And
Yep.
right now, probably to get a new roof on a relatively modest house is probably $8,000. Right? So if you say, okay, I have 24 in my reserve account, that means 3 roofs out of your portfolio could all fly away and you can still replace them and not have to tap into your own money. Now you might say, actually, you're crazy. Which circumstance would be that all 3 houses lose their roof and need, who knows? I'm just saying that's kind of one way to look at it. If you say, no, I'm thinking air conditioning and a new one is 1,500, then I don't know, you can do 10 air conditionings if you needed to, right? The point is, what is the pivot point? The pivot point is the point where you say, even in the worst case of circumstances happening all at once to my portfolio, I will have enough money sitting in my reserve. And it really kind of financially makes no sense to keep adding those $280 every month from all these different houses that you have.
Right.
So what you end up starting to do, in my opinion, and that's what we advise in my mentoring program, is that you can either keep that additional cash flow, or what I now do, and I do this not just for beyond the pivot point, but even before that, you put the money, the whole money, meaning those $480, you put all of it every month into tokenized real estate. Because then you have all the benefits of Ideal that we went through earlier, again, just on a smaller scale. And that starts with $50 a month, right? So 480 gives you basically 5 tokens, and then every other month is 6 tokens. And so you apply them. We don't have to go into the details. I am happy to explain if anybody wants to know how that works. But fundamentally, now you're having your reserve account collecting rent and collecting appreciation and collecting depreciation and collecting income and so forth. The same idea thing, just on a much, much smaller scale. And when the number gets big enough, then you can say, okay, now I keep accumulating it. And the beauty of a tokenized account is that any day you say, okay, now it has gotten to, let's say your number is 20,000 for reserves, plus another 20,000 that I've accumulated. Now I take the second 20,000 and buy myself the next property. Right? So you're growing your portfolio while your reserves keep growing, at least at inflation, sometimes even more. But the pivot point, to come back to your question, is you determine how much reserve is reasonable. And whether you say this is purely a number, my number is 25,000, so I always have 25,000 in reserve for a portfolio of 10 properties, because I'm thinking, okay, 3 roofs or 10 air conditionings, that's about the worst case that can happen, right? Especially since they're not all in the same location. Because I have heard one person once say, well, what happens if like a hurricane or tornado? I said, yeah, that's why we have a cluster here in Idaho, we have a cluster in Ohio, we have a cluster in Florida. It's very rare that you have those all happening, those tornadoes and hurricanes, just over your little cluster of houses.
Right.
You know?
No, that's great. Well, I would like you to tell us a little bit more about your podcast, and thank you for inviting me to come on. I know we're going to record I think next week, or maybe it was a week after. I'm going to be on your show, Ideal Investor Show. But what's really unique about your show is you record way more often than weekly. I do this podcast weekly because that's the pace that my business allows, and that's the time that I have allows. But your pace is different. Tell us about that.
Well, one thing that I found is, and it's not me coming up, a guy named Sam Crowley, who's been podcasting since Jesus or something like that, walked the,
Yes, Sam.
at least according to him, how many, I think he has done like thousands of episodes.
Thousands,
the point is, he said to me, and your audience can judge how right or wrong he is. When you allow me to come on your show and you interview me, you graciously give me the opportunity to describe what is ideal, what is wealth, maybe still have a minute to describe what is grower. but it doesn't give you a whole much for describing what you actually do or what has happened recently, or how is Jenna feeling right now? What's going on with her? What's going on in her business? What's going on in her life? So what Sam said to me, if you want more engagement, you need to give people something. And what I basically decided, I do once a week an interview like we do right now. And then all the other days, I do like 5 to 10 minute little things where it's just me telling people about what I'm seeing in the industry.
That's very unique. I like it. I actually like it. And yes, I've been discussing with my podcast coach and my whole team going, maybe should we do that? Is that something we're going to do in 2025? And it's definitely on the table, especially after we talked about Sam Crowley. And quite frankly, Axel, is so many people approached me. I mean, I had no less than 4 people tell me that I had to have you on the show. So I said, okay. And this is your model, which is good. So anything
Yeah,
else?
and I mean, the thing is,
Go ahead.
for you, Sam, for example, has this crazy thing about his audio episodes. He does them always in his car. Right? Like I could imagine you sitting somewhere in Maui at the beach just before sunset and, doing a picture like the different days. Like, how does it look at sunset in Maui, right? And you're telling people about whatever's going on.
Yeah, very different business model. And you know what? I'm okay with that. It's just a matter of or is that what the listener wants? So we'll see. But anything else that you want to share with the listener?
Well, one quick thing, I mentioned this, and you asked me at the beginning, what's the deal about this grower thing in Ideal Wealth Grower? And I mentioned the mentoring program a few times. What we really do is I developed a model that is, again, not based purely on my own invention, but there is a pretty famous guy named John Whitmore who wrote a book called Performance Coaching. And in it, he has a model that's called the Grow model, very well established in the business industry or in business coaching. And I looked at it and I came to the conclusion, I hope that makes you smile a little bit, is this really only works for the very first session. Because
It's true.
and this first part, the grow, is in same what I do. The first ask, if you and I were to do it, I would say, Jennifer, what is your goal, let's say, in real estate investing for like the next 12 months and the next 12 years? And we talk about it. Then I would say, okay, Jennifer, the R, what's your current reality? How does it actually look like? How far have you already gotten? Then the O is, okay, what kind of obstacles are currently in your way and what kind of opportunities might you have that we could take advantage of to make your goal become reality? And we talk about that, and then I will say, okay, that all sounds good. Now, which actions to take us one step further will you take, W, to get a little closer to realize this goal and make it reality? And you will say, I call, I do this, I send email, I research, what have you. And then the book ends. And so why
Right.
do I call it grower? Because next time we meet, and not just this one time, next time we meet, I would say, hey, Jennifer, tell me what your experience was with these actions that you promised to take.
The
Which
feedback.
is the E, right? And you will say, oh, calling people to find out about properties really sucks. So see, that's why I tell you, just take the ones I have already vetted, so you don't need to do that, right? Just side note. And then we will say, okay, so that's that one experience. Did this experience create any results for you in the context of getting you closer to your goals, which is the last R? And you might say, okay, I realize that working with an expert who has a portfolio of properties I can choose from, where all the criteria have already been applied, gets me faster to my goal. I say, okay, so if you get faster to your goal, now we're closing the circle. Can you make your goal bigger? You might say, okay, well, if I look at it that way, maybe for the first few years, I can only buy 1 property per year, but if it really starts cash flowing, can maybe do 2. And
Right.
so what looked like 15 years until I have my time freedom point, maybe I can do it in 9. Okay, and then we go, okay, so now you have a new current reality and we start, now it becomes a cycle, right? And that's basically how that works. And I'm not pointing it out as I did right now, but when people ask themselves at the end of a mentoring session, they typically find that we touched on all of it. That's, you do it long enough, it kind of becomes part of the regular conversation.
Of course, of course. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. If a listener wants to get a hold of you, how do they contact you?
Well, since you mentioned both, you can go to idealinvestorshow.com. You land on a web page that has a little green button that says book a call, or you can go to idealwealthgrower.com, has another green button that says discovery call for some reason. But the main thing that it accomplishes is you get on my calendar, you pick a time, and I always feel, and I so much love that we have this kind of nice, conversation, getting to know each other again for a second or third time. But that's really what I want to offer to everybody. Let's first talk to each other, get to know each other, see if we vibe correctly, if what you want in the G for grower is what I can help you with, or do you want a large apartment complex and I'm not the right person? But only by talking about it can we find out. So that's basically the best way. Book a call, let's get together, talk about it, and see if I can help you.
That's awesome. Axel, thank you so much. You were an absolute wealth of information. You mentioned lots of books, other podcasters. You did all kinds of calculations. I love how your mind thinks analytically with all your projections and hey, for example, and all your acronyms. I mean, wow, I'm going to have to transcribe the show today just to go back to all the different things that you had mentioned. But thank you so much for being on the show today with me.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for having me, Jennifer.
Excellent. Take care.